Hello, in this video I want to continue some of the conversation that we've been having about Moten and intellectual property protections. If you haven't seen from the last video, I started off a conversation about what I think about Moten on the affirmative on the intellectual property protections resolution, and I think that if you're just trying to get a base idea of what an argument like that could look like, it definitely is helpful to look at the last video that I did, because I think that it does a good job really setting out what I think are some of the key components of what a criticism of the September-October resolution looks like in LD, and what I think it particularly does to produce a different kind of like strategy or way of looking at not only the international field but also intellectual property protections as like a field of law. And I think there's a lot of rich literature for people that are either Moten and Harney themselves or people that are really drawing from them and citing them from them heavily to talk about the way in which intellectual property protections invest in various vectors of like anti-blackness, racial capitalism, etc. And then I think that it has really strategic angles against a lot of like the general arguments that you'll see through this resolution. And so a lot of this video is to kind of continue on some of the stuff that I've been talking about for the last one and apply a lot of that stuff to the question of how you deal with things like the criticism, the plan, and the disad. And so I think that having the context of what type of arguments are key for making an affirmative like this are really important when you're listening to this video, because the types of things that I'm going to say are strategic against the criticism that I think are strategic against counterplans and disads are really built in from like this stronger when I see critique of like the way in which the international functions and the way in which intellectual property protections functions as a field, and having both components I think is really important for having like a really thorough critique of like what this resolution is attempting to do and the way that the 1AC kind of serves as a corrective to that. So when I think just generally about the way in which this applies to criticisms and the way that I think that Moten argument should answer criticism on this type of resolution, I really think that the Moten argument should be a really big question of like how do we reach the scale of accessing like an international way of organizing outside of the capacity of sovereignty. And I feel like a lot of criticisms at the alternative level will not be able to compete with Moten without being able to like give you a lot of access to things like a permutation argument. And so I think setting that up from the beginning with just like a strong framework argument that is about why things like intellectual property protections in the WTO require us to have a different type of relationship to the international field overall, which requires us to have a different like relationship to the way in which we socially organize, and then make warrants about like why, for instance, the way that the 1AC is organizing does that kind of work, builds that type of mutual aid. And I think specifically in the context of like medicine, there are really good quotes from Moten and Harney that it's like it's not about why we take to the streets, it's about like what and who we take to the streets, right? And I think that it's really interesting to kind of use these quotes as a way of framing like it is a question of the way in which we react in terms of the resolution. And so the kind of like base level like structural criticism that teams will make about questions of like fugitivity and things like that are really secondary to the question of like how we organize in the face of violence, which I feel like a lot of alternatives kind of like cop to in the world of things like permutations. And I think there are a lot of interesting net benefits to win about like how the sovereign attempts to capture like radical alternatives, and so the types of like organizing that has to be done in the face of that has to be really intentional and isn't even necessarily a question about escaping all capacity to be captured, but rather like acknowledging that that kind of like context is ever present and doing something active against that. I think then comparing that to the way in which Moten is able to frame this as like a question of like the international scale makes it a lot easier for you to have really interesting like impact debates that I feel like you don't see a lot of like critical debates, because I feel like so often a lot of KVK debates, a lot of the impact analysis is just a question of like how we think about things kind of like ethically in relationship to each other, and what that means is how we frame things like hypothetically. But I feel like on this particular type of like set of argumentation, you have a lot of range to be like the types of questions that we ask about the international and the way that which we relate to the field of intellectual property protections has real material questions on the way in which various alternatives to like normal means to medicine, normal access to vaccines and things like that are kind of like policed and controlled, and that creates like a different type of relationship to the way in which we think about like medicine and other types of like critical resources that produce their own particular forms of violence. And so I think that being able to win, that the criticism is able to kind of like access this even at an epistemological level for what we do once we lead debate. I think there's a lot of ways in which the affirmative has a lot of like in routes to being able to win, that the criticism and the affirmative are really converging at places that are really good for like an affirmative ballot. I think after that it's really just a question of like how do you continue like apply offense to the alternative, and how do you make sure that your offense is like consistent and diverse. I think it's really easy when you have such a like cohesive set of arguments to easily get it set up and just making like one line of arguments that's just like, if we win our framework thing, then we can apply this type of pressure to the alternative, and that's the way that we'll win like all of these debates. But I definitely think leaving a field of options over where you're pressuring the alternative not just through the way in which it attempts to not, the way in which it like fails to scale up to the question of the international, but also how it kind of like can individualize people, privatize our response to things like anti-blackness, racial capitalism, etc. And now without the kind of like social reorganization of the 1AC, there's kind of like this like vacuum left open on how we actually build connections between people in disparate like social locations and things like that. I think when you transition this into like the counterplan and dissad, kind of like a different angle into this whole type of debate, a lot of the advice that I would give about how you respond to the counterplan and dissad would just simply be prepared to win that like politics or policy is insufficient to really solve some of the problems that we're kind of like having at a structural level for why things like climate change and types of like terminal like structural violence is happening to particular communities. And if that is true, that we need to be able to risk it all in the face of the kind of like extinction level claims that teams will make, especially in the field of like intellectual property protections. I feel like a lot of the arguments that teams want to make in terms of counterplans and dissads are mostly in the field of how can they kind of like win these arguments about why the things like economic sustainability and overall access to medicine that are sustained by having a modicum of like intellectual property protections, and why that's like key to like public safety and things like that, are all ways in which they attempt to like use things like the public and use things like general citizenship and humanity as weight against communities that will like continually be marginalized and structurally impacted by the way that things like intellectual property protections are kind of like structured at like a top level question. And so I think a lot of the things that you want to push are that there's a kind of like ethic or way that we are living that pushes us inevitably to extinction because of the way in which we're treating like certain populations, certain resources, etc. as disposable, and necessitate kind of like violence at the international level. And so the only question of how we resolve this is to kind of like risk everything in the face of possibly being able to lose it all, because of the way in which like our history and our relationship to disposability is so deeply entrenched in like various types of histories of violence. And I think being ready to take that up against various types of like impact scenarios is really the most important, because I feel like the way that you generally answer things like the link debate and the mutual exclusivity questions between things like the counterplan and the affirmative, or the link questions between the dissad and the affirmative, will mostly be like concessions of the link argument in favor of like an impact turn or a link turn. But I think that a lot of the questions that you want to like raise outside of that are ways that you can uniquely address these impact scenarios, and why the question of being able to like put our types of like ethical and social kind of commitments in favor in as primary, or before the way in which we think about just the individual valuing of different bodies, is a really important set of questions that I think has a long legacy in arguments such as revolutionary suicide and other arguments that can be like really aligned with like the black radical tradition for like years and years. And I think really having that as part of your argumentation that you're making against counterplans and dissents adds that other layer of impact calculus that I think definitely throws a different type of bone into like what the judge is thinking for the ballot overall, and can be really strategic for how you kind of like move forward in terms of this strategy. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully you'll enjoy more videos that I'll be doing talking about Moten and Harney on this resolution. And yeah, thanks so much for tuning in.